Emily Carter stood in the doorway of Miller's Café, her fingers instinctively finding the cool metal of her late husband's dog tag hanging from her neck. The morning sunlight caught the engraved letters of Michael's name, casting a brief glimmer that only she noticed. 3 years since that fateful knock on her door, and still this small piece of metal remained her anchor in a world that had shifted beneath her feet. The cafe buzzed with the familiar symphony of morning rituals, the gentle clink of silverware against plates, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the low murmur of conversations that filled the warm air. The scent of fresh coffee and bacon wrapped around her like a comforting blanket, a momentary respite from the hollow silence of her apartment. Emily took a deep breath and stepped inside, her eyes scanning for an empty table. The place was packed. Businessmen hunched over laptops, mothers with young children, elderly couples sharing sections of the newspaper. She spotted a small table tucked away in the corner, a forgotten oasis in the bustling space. Making her way through the maze of chairs and busy servers, she settled into the worn wooden seat, her handbag placed carefully on the floor beside her. From this vantage point, she could see the entire cafe, the chalkboard menu with its colorful script, the vintage photographs lining the walls, the waitresses in their blue aprons navigating the space with practiced ease. One waitress in particular caught Emily's eye. Young, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, moving between tables with a coffee pot in one hand and a notepad in the other. The waitress glanced in Emily's direction, their eyes meeting. Briefly, Emily offered a small smile, her hand reflexively touching Michael's tag again. The gesture had become a habit, a silent conversation with a ghost. The waitress's gaze lingered for a moment before sliding away, turning instead to a table of businessmen who had just been seated. Minutes passed. Emily watched as the waitress refilled coffees, took orders, delivered plates steaming with breakfast to tables that had arrived after her. Once, twice, 3 times the waitress passed near Emily's table, each time looking through her as if she were made of glass. The businessmen laughed loudly at something, their cups refilled again. A young couple was seated and immediately attended. 2 menus placed before them with a friendly smile. Emily's stomach tightened, not from hunger, but from a familiar feeling. The subtle sting of being overlooked, forgotten in plain sight. It wasn't an unfamiliar sensation. Since Michael's death, she had often felt this way, invisible, as if her grief had somehow rendered her transparent to the world around her. She watched the waitress deliver plates of golden pancakes to a family seated by the window, the children's faces lighting up at the sight. The mother caught Emily's eye and offered a sympathetic smile, having noticed her prolonged wait. Emily nodded in acknowledgement, her fingers once again finding Michael's tag, tracing the embossed letters of his name, his service number. Touchstones of a life now confined to memory. 20 minutes had passed. The morning crowd had thinned slightly, yet still no one had approached her table. No menu, no water, no acknowledgement. The dog tag felt suddenly heavy against her chest, a weight pulling her down into the chair. In this moment, surrounded by people yet utterly alone, Emily felt Michael's absence more acutely than she had in months. Emily's patience finally wore thin, the weight of being invisible becoming too heavy to bear. She raised her hand slightly, a gentle gesture seeking acknowledgement in the bustling cafe. Her voice, soft but clear, cut through the ambient noise. "Excuse me, could I please get some service?" The words hung in the air, drawing a few curious glances from nearby tables. But instead of the blonde waitress, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a crisp button-down shirt emerged from behind the counter. His face was set in hard lines, brow furrowed as he approached Emily's table. The name tag pinned to his chest read Greg, manager, in bold letters that seemed to announce his authority. He stopped abruptly at her table, arms crossed, eyes cold as winter frost. They flickered briefly to the dog tag nestled against Emily's collarbone before returning. to her face. "We don't serve people like you here," he said, his voice carrying across the cafe like a slap. The ambient chatter died instantly. Forks paused midway to mouths. Coffee cups hovered in suspended animation. The espresso machine's hiss, suddenly, seemed deafening in the vacuum of silence. Emily's mind raced, confusion washing over her like ice water. She glanced down at herself. Simple jeans, a navy cardigan, nothing that would mark her as unwelcome. Her hand instinctively reached for Michael's tag, a habit born of uncertainty. "I don't understand," she said, her voice smaller now, bewilderment etched across her features. "What do you mean, people like me?" Greg's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking deliberately to the military tag between her fingers. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "People who wear their dead husband's tags like some kind of trophy," he spat, leaning closer, flashing it around, hoping for special treatment, discounts, maybe a free breakfast. Let me guess, he was some hero who died for our freedom. The last word dripped with mockery. Emily's breath caught in her throat, a physical pain blooming in her chest. The room seemed to tilt sideways, the faces of other patrons blurring at the edges of her vision. 3 years of carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble under the weight of this unexpected cruelty. "My husband served 2 tours in Afghanistan," she whispered, each word fighting its way past the knot in her throat. "He gave everything for this country, and now you're here looking for handouts," Greg scoffed, using his service as a get-out-of-paying card. "We've seen your type before." Every syllable landed like a hammer blow. Emily's fingers closed around Michael's tag so tightly the edges bit into her palm. The cafe remained frozen in horrified fascination, a theater audience witnessing an unscripted tragedy unfold. A businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A mother pulled her child closer. An elderly man stared down at his coffee cup, knuckles white around the handle. Not one voice rose in protest. Not one person moved to intervene. In their silence, Emily found a second wound, perhaps deeper than Greg's words. The collective muteness of strangers bearing witness to her humiliation, yet choosing the safety of inaction. She looked around at their averted eyes, their sudden fascination with tabletops and coffee mugs, their studied indifference. The weight of their silence pressed against her from all sides, a suffocating blanket of tacit approval. Emily stood slowly, legs trembling beneath her. The scrape of her chair against the floor echoed in the unnatural quiet. Dignity was all she had left now, and she clung to it with the same fierce determination that had carried her through the darkest days after Michael's death. Outside, morning sunlight continued to bathe the street in golden warmth, oblivious to how the world inside the cafe had just shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Emily stood frozen in place, her entire body trembling like a leaf caught in autumn winds. The cafe's warmth had evaporated, leaving only a cold, hostile space where moments ago she had sought simple comfort. She could feel dozens of eyes on her skin, a physical weight pressing down from all sides. Her voice cracked, betraying her as emotions surged up from deep within. "I just wanted breakfast." She fought desperately against the tears welling in her eyes, refusing to give this man the satisfaction of seeing her break. The dog tag pressed against her palm, Michael's name cutting into her skin, a physical pain to anchor her against the emotional storm. Greg's face remained impassive, unmoved by her quiet dignity. He gestured dismissively toward the door, his hand slicing through the air like a judge delivering a final verdict. "Go find a place that actually cares about your sob story," he said loudly, making sure his voice carried to every corner of the cafe. "Maybe try the VA. They're paid to pretend they care about people like your husband." The words landed like physical blows. Emily flinched, each syllable striking deeper than the last. She glanced around the room one final time. a silent plea for someone, anyone, to speak up. A middle-aged man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably, coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips, eyes darting between Emily and his phone. An elderly couple exchanged troubled glances, the woman's hand tightening around her fork until her knuckles whitened. A mother at a corner table pulled her curious child closer, whispering something in his ear while avoiding Emily's gaze. There, discomfort was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick fog, yet not one voice rose in her defense. Their silence was its own kind of cruelty, perhaps more cutting than Greg's words. With trembling hands, Emily gathered her purse, the strap catching awkwardly on her chair. The small fumble sent a napkin dispenser clattering to the floor, the sound explosive in the unnatural quiet. Her cheeks burned with humiliation as she knelt to retrieve it, feeling every eye in the room watching her final indignity. As she straightened, she caught sight of something unexpected. A young woman at a nearby table, no older than 25, with dark curly hair and intense eyes. Unlike the others, she was looking directly at Emily, her gaze unwavering. In her hands, partially concealed beneath the table's edge, her phone was tilted toward the confrontation, its record light blinking steadily. Sophie, her name tag from the bookstore across the street visible on her jacket, gave Emily the smallest of nods, a tiny acknowledgement that pierced through the veil of isolation surrounding her. It wasn't help, not really, but it was something, witness to a moment the world would otherwise forget. Emily pushed through the door, the bell's cheerful jingle a mocking counterpoint to her exit. Outside, the morning sunlight felt harsh against her tear-streaked face. She moved quickly down the sidewalk, desperate to put distance between herself and the cafe, between herself and the memory of those silent faces. Michael's tag bounced gently against her collarbone with each hurried step, the only friend accompanying her retreat. Behind her, through the glass storefront of Miller's Café, Sophie continued recording, her finger swiping to end the video only. After Emily had disappeared from view, her face hardened with resolve as she looked down at her screen, the cafe's name clearly visible in the final frame. The evening light cast long shadows across Sophie's apartment as she sat cross-legged on her worn sofa, the day's events playing on an endless loop in her mind. The stark image of Emily's face, shattered dignity, barely held together by sheer will, haunted her. The memory of her own silence weighed heavier with each passing hour, a burden of complicity she couldn't shake. Her thumb hovered over her phone screen, the video she'd captured queued up and ready. The cafe's name was clearly visible in the background, Greg's face in sharp focus as he delivered his cruel words. Sophie had never considered herself an activist, had never been one to make waves, but something about the quiet devastation in Emily's eyes had ignited a spark she couldn't extinguish. This widow was just denied service for being a soldier's wife. Unacceptable. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed the caption, each word deliberate, measured. She added hashtags, @T military widow, disrespect, never forget, and then, before doubt could creep in, pressed share. The post entered the digital world with little fanfare, just one more droplet in an endless ocean of content. Sophie set her phone aside, made herself dinner, washed dishes, all while trying to convince herself she'd done enough. By the time she crawled into bed, her post had garnered a modest 100 shares, nothing extraordinary, but perhaps enough to matter to one widow who believed no one cared. Dawn broke with her phone vibrating itself off the nightstand. 1,000 shares, 8,000 comments. Notification after notification poured in like a digital tsunami. Is this Miller's Café on Oakwood Drive? My brother died in Afghanistan. This breaks my heart. Veterans, let's pay this cafe a visit. The video had been picked up by a popular military family support page overnight. then shared by an account run by a retired general with millions of followers. From there, it spread like wildfire through military communities across the country, base by base, unit by unit, family by family. Sophie watched in awe as the numbers climbed higher with each passing minute. Local news stations were sending her messages requesting interviews. National outlets were embedding the video in breaking news stories. A hashtag was trending. Remember Emily. Across town, in the quiet stillness of her apartment, Emily Carter remained unaware of the gathering storm. Her phone, switched off after a night of muffled tears, sat dark and silent on her bedside table. The dog tag that had sparked such cruelty now rested beside a framed photo of Michael in uniform, his smile frozen in time, proud, strong, forever young. Meanwhile, at Miller's Café, Greg opened for business as usual, brewing coffee with practiced efficiency, barking orders at his staff. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as the first customers of the morning shuffled in. Nothing seemed different. Nothing felt changed. He hadn't seen the video. He hadn't checked social media. He had no idea that his words had been captured and broadcast to millions. No idea that among those millions were men and women who had sworn the same oath as Michael Carter, who wore the same uniform, who understood the sacrifice in ways most civilians never could. Greg wiped down the counter, completely oblivious to the gathering storm. He didn't know about the emergency meeting called by the local Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter, couldn't see the determined faces of retired Marines organizing carpools, couldn't hear the rumble of motorcycle engines as members of the Patriot Guard riders checked their routes. He didn't know that in military bases across 3 states, service members were requesting emergency leave, that a colonel who had served with Michael Carter was making phone calls, that buses were being chartered. Greg simply flipped the sign on the door from closed to open, blissfully unaware that tomorrow would bring consequences he couldn't possibly imagine. Help was indeed on the way, moving with the precision and purpose that only military training could instill. Morning light filtered through Emily's blinds, casting long shadows across her bedroom floor. She lay motionless, Michael's dog tag clutched in her palm, the metal warmed by her touch. The humiliation of yesterday still clung to her like a second skin, the memory of those silent faces burning behind her eyelids. The thought of facing the world today seemed impossible, a mountain too steep to climb. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from an unknown number. "This is Sophie from the cafe yesterday. Please meet me at Miller's at 10 a.m. Trust me on this. It's important." Emily stared at the message, confusion mingling with dread. Return to the scene of her humiliation. The very thought made her stomach twist. Yet something about the urgency in those simple words tugged at her. With trembling fingers, she typed back a single word: "Why?" The response came immediately. Because sometimes the world surprises you. Across town, Greg whistled tunelessly. As he unlocked Miller's Café, yesterday's incident already fading from memory. Just another difficult customer dealt with, another day in the service industry. The morning routine unfolded with practiced efficiency. Coffee brewing, pastries arranged, tables wiped down. His staff moved cautiously around him, exchanging glances when his back was turned, their phones buzzing with notifications they dared not check in his presence. The clock ticked toward 10 a.m. The cafe was unusually quiet for a morning rush, just a handful of regulars nursing their coffees, speaking in hushed tones. Greg checked his watch with a frown, wondering where all the customers were. The bell above the door chimed, drawing his attention. A man stood in the doorway, ramrod straight, dressed in crisp military blues, adorned with ribbons and medals that caught the light. His face was expressionless, eyes scanning the room with deliberate precision before landing on Greg. Without a word, he stepped inside and took a seat at the counter. The bell chimed again. Another uniformed figure entered, a woman this time, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her posture equally precise. She nodded to the first soldier and chose a table by the window. The bell rang a third time, 2 more uniforms, then 3 more, then 5. Greg's pulse quickened as the pattern became unmistakable. The bell now seemed to ring without pause, a relentless percussion announcing each new arrival. Air Force blues, Army greens, Marine dress uniforms, Navy whites. They flowed through the door in a steady stream, filling every seat, lining the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder where no more chairs remained. Not one ordered coffee, not one spoke a word. They simply waited, their collective silence more deafening than any shout could have been. Outside, the street had transformed. Military vehicles lined the curb, jeeps, trucks, personal cars with base stickers on their windshields. A group of motorcycle riders in leather vests emblazoned with military insignia formed a respectful line across the street. Local news vans had appeared, cameras pointed toward the cafe's entrance. The bell rang one final time. Sophie stepped in, phone in hand, her eyes meeting Greg's for just a moment before she turned back toward the door, extending her hand to someone. Outside, and then in the space that parted before her like water, walked Emily Carter. Her steps were hesitant at first, then steadier as she took in the sea of uniforms that had materialized on her behalf. Michael's dog tag gleamed against her. Collarbone, catching the light as she moved forward, the transformation was instant and absolute. As one, every uniformed service person in the cafe rose to their feet, backs straight, heels together, hands rising in perfect unison to their brows in a formal salute, not to Emily, but to the memory of the fallen soldier whose name she carried. Greg stood frozen behind the counter, the color draining from his face as comprehension dawned at last. The silence spoke volumes. The uniformed men and women moved with practiced precision, a choreographed display of unity as they claimed every available seat in Miller's Café. Chairs scraped against tile floors, tables shifted to accommodate more bodies, yet somehow the sound seemed muted beneath the weight of their collective purpose. Their faces remained impassive, eyes forward, backs straight, a living wall of silent rebuke. Greg clutched the edge of the counter, his knuckles whitening as he watched his cafe transform before his eyes. The usual morning chatter had vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against his eardrums. The few civilian customers who had been present before this military arrival sat frozen in place, coffee cups suspended halfway. To lips, witnesses to a moment they somehow understood was historic. From the center of the uniformed crowd, a figure emerged. Tall and imposing, with shoulders that spoke of both physical strength and the weight of command, he moved deliberately toward the counter. 3 silver oak leaves gleamed on his collar. Lieutenant Colonel, not captain as some might mistake. His name tag read Davis, polished to a mirror shine against the dark fabric of his uniform. The distance between the door and counter couldn't have been more than 20 feet, yet his journey seemed to stretch into eternity. With each measured step, Greg felt his carefully constructed world crumbling further. The security cameras in the corners of the cafe, the smartphone cameras now pointed in his direction, the silent witnesses lining his walls, all of them recording. This moment of reckoning, Lieutenant Colonel Davis stopped precisely 2 feet from the counter, his stance wide and grounded, hands clasped behind his back in parade rest. His gaze, level and unflinching, bore into Greg with the weight of not just one man's judgment, but the judgment of an entire brotherhood. "I understand," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silence despite its measured tone, "that you don't serve people like us here." Each word landed with the precision of artillery fire, carefully targeted and devastatingly accurate. The question hung in the air, unanswered yet demanding response. I don't," Greg stammered, his tongue suddenly thick and uncooperative. Sweat beaded along his hairline despite the cool morning air. There's been a misunderstanding. A muscle twitched in Davis's jaw, the only indication that he'd heard Greg's feeble excuse. He didn't blink, didn't shift his stance, simply allowed the silence to stretch uncomfortably between them. Yesterday, Davis continued as if Greg hadn't spoken. A widow wearing her husband's dog tags came in seeking service. His voice remained even, professional, yet something dangerous lurked beneath the surface calm. Staff Sergeant Michael Carter, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, killed in action defending this country. Behind Davis, a Marine in dress blues shifted, slightly, his face tight with controlled emotion. Michael's unit, Greg realized with sinking certainty. These weren't just random military personnel. They had come with purpose, with personal connection. I didn't know. Greg began, but Davis raised a hand, the gesture silencing him more effectively than a shout. He gave everything, Davis said, his words now carrying an edge that cut through the air like a blade. Everything, and you couldn't even give his widow a cup of coffee. Greg's eyes darted frantically around the cafe, seeking an escape route, a sympathetic face, anything that might offer reprieve from this nightmare unfolding in broad daylight. Instead, he found only a wall of unwavering stares, a united front of military bearing and barely contained fury. It was a mistake, Greg whispered, his voice barely audible even in the profound silence of the cafe. A terrible mistake, Lieutenant. Colonel Davis leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to match Greg's whisper, yet somehow reaching every corner of the room. Yes, he agreed, the simple word carrying the weight of judgment. It was. Time seemed suspended in Miller's Café, crystallized in a moment that would forever divide Greg's life into before and after. The silence had weight, pressing down from all sides, broken only by the occasional click of a camera phone or the soft rustle of uniforms as soldiers shifted in their seats. Every eye remained fixed on the exchange between Lieutenant Colonel Davis and the now trembling cafe manager. From the corner of her eye, Emily noticed movement at the cafe entrance. The bell chimed softly as a woman with sharp eyes and a press badge stepped inside, notebook in one hand, smartphone recording in the other. Her gaze swept across the sea of uniforms before landing on the confrontation at the counter, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to something closer, to hunger. A reporter who recognized a career-defining story unfolding before her. "Tara Chen, Channel 8 News," she announced, loud enough to ensure her voice carried to every corner of the suddenly crowded space. "We've been getting calls all morning about a situation developing here. Would anyone care to comment on what's happening?" Greg's face, already pale, now took on an ashen quality. The presence of local news transformed this from an uncomfortable moment to a potential catastrophe, one that would extend far beyond these walls. His eyes darted frantically from the reporter to Davis, to the dozens of uniformed personnel filling his cafe. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding," he said, his voice cracking under the strain. Sweat beaded along his hairline as he gestured vaguely toward Emily. "I had no idea Mrs. Carter was a military widow. We support our troops here. Always have." The lie hung in the air, transparent and brittle. Lieutenant Colonel Davis turned slightly, acknowledging the reporter's presence without shifting his attention from Greg. "Perhaps you should ask Mrs. Carter about yesterday's misunderstanding," he suggested, his tone making it clear exactly how much he believed Greg's backpedaling. Before Emily could speak, a soldier near the window raised his hand, capturing everyone's attention. "I think we're all hungry after coming out to support our fellow military family," he said, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's order some breakfast." The suggestion rippled through the uniformed crowd, met with nods and murmurs of agreement. One by one, they began calling out orders, each more elaborate than the last. Full breakfast plate with eggs over easy, hash browns extra crispy, side of pancakes with blueberries. Denver omelette with extra cheese, toast buttered on both sides, fresh squeezed orange juice. Belgian waffle with strawberries, whipped cream on the side, bacon extra crispy. The waitstaff scrambled to write down the orders, pens flying across. Notepads, while Greg watched in confusion that slowly transformed to desperate hope. Perhaps they were offering an olive branch, a way to make amends through service. For 45 minutes, the kitchen worked at fever pitch. Plates piled high with carefully prepared food emerged from the swinging doors, delivered to tables with nervous smiles and shaking hands. The rich aromas of coffee, bacon, and maple syrup filled the air, a cruel counterpoint to the tension that still gripped the room. And then, as the last plate was set down, Lieutenant Colonel Davis stood. Without a word, he placed a crisp $20 bill on his untouched food, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the door. One by one, every uniformed person in the cafe followed suit, leaving bills atop plates of food they had ordered, but would not consume. The message was clear: we could have been your customers. We would have paid. We would have returned. But some things can't be purchased or consumed. Some things, like respect, must be freely given. As they filed out in orderly silence, the reporter's camera captured every moment of the exodus, broadcasting in real time to a city already buzzing with the story of Miller's Café and the widow who had been turned away. Greg stood amid the abandoned meals, the money left behind a final, damning statement more eloquent than any words could have been. The story of Miller's Café spread through the city like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. By nightfall, the video of the military's silent protest had been viewed millions of times. Morning news programs featured interviews with veterans who had witnessed the event, their faces solemn as they recounted the wall of uniforms, the untouched food, the quiet dignity of their collective statement. Outside the cafe, a transformation occurred overnight. The once bustling sidewalk stood empty. The tables that normally filled with morning commuters remained vacant. Occasional pedestrians would slow as they approached, glancing at the storefront with expressions ranging from curiosity to open disgust before quickening their pace to pass by. Some stopped to take photos of the establishment, capturing images of the cafe that had become a symbol of disrespect toward those who served. Inside, Greg paced the empty floor, phone pressed to his ear as he pleaded with suppliers for extensions. On payments, the handful of employees who hadn't already quit stood awkwardly by the counter, watching their hours and livelihoods evaporate with each customer who didn't walk through the door. "We need to issue a statement," his business partner urged over the phone, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "An apology, something, anything. We're drowning here." The press release went out that afternoon, carefully worded sentences, crafted by a hastily hired PR consultant, expressing deepest regrets for the unfortunate misunderstanding and promising renewed commitment to serving all members of our community with the respect they deserve. Greg stood stiffly before Channel 8's cameras, reading the words without meeting the lens, his voice flat and unconvincing. Too little, too late. The damage had already calcified into something permanent, a stain no carefully worded statement could remove. Reservations cancelled. Regular customers disappeared. The phone that once rang constantly with takeout orders now remained silent for hours at a stretch. 1 week after the incident, Greg flipped the sign to closed at 3 in the afternoon, the lunch rush having consisted of exactly 4 customers, all of whom appeared to be there more out of morbid curiosity than hunger. As he locked the door behind him, his gaze fell on a familiar figure across the street, Emily Carter, standing quietly at the bus stop, Michael's dog tag catching the afternoon sunlight. Something snapped inside him. Abandoning all pretense of dignity, Greg stormed across the street, his face contorted with rage and desperation. "Are you happy now?" he demanded, voice cracking as he gestured wildly toward the empty cafe. You've destroyed everything I built. 15 years of work, gone because you couldn't handle a little criticism." Emily didn't flinch, didn't step back from his advancing fury. She simply looked at him, her eyes calm pools that reflected his own distorted anger back at him. In her silence was a strength that only grew more powerful in contrast to his crumbling composure. "My employees are losing their jobs," he continued, desperation bleeding into his words. "I'm facing bankruptcy, all because you had to wear that thing around your neck and make everything about your husband's service." Still, Emily said nothing. Her fingers found Michael's tag, the familiar metal warm against her skin. What could she possibly say to this man who understood so little about sacrifice, about loss, about consequences? A bus approached, hydraulic brakes hissing as it slowed to a stop beside them. Emily turned away from Greg's fury, climbing the steps without a backward glance. From her window seat, she watched him standing abandoned on the sidewalk, diminished by his own choices, destroyed not by her actions, but by his own. As the bus pulled away, Emily closed her eyes. Michael's dog tag clutched tightly in her palm. Some battles required no words at all. Some victories were measured not in what was gained, but in what was finally understood. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp white paper bearing the official military insignia in the corner. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she slid her thumb beneath the seal, unsure what to expect after the tumultuous events of the past week. Inside, a formal invitation on heavy cardstock. "Your presence is requested at Fort Callahan, Thursday at 1400 hours. Transportation will be provided. No explanation, no details. Just a date, a time, and a promise of passage." Thursday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the first hint of autumn. Emily stood on her front porch, Michael's dog tag nestled against her collarbone, its familiar weight a comfort against the uncertainty fluttering in her chest. A black sedan with government plates pulled into her driveway precisely at 1 p.m. A uniformed driver stepping out to open the rear door with a respectful nod. The drive to Fort Callahan passed in contemplative silence, the sprawling military base appearing on the horizon like a small city unto itself. As they approached the main gate, Emily noticed something unusual. A line of soldiers standing at attention along the entrance road, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their posture ramrod straight. The car slowed to a crawl, passing between these silent sentinels, each one offering a crisp salute as Emily passed. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, not captain as Emily had initially thought, waited at the end of this human corridor. His face, solemn, yet somehow warmer than it had been during the confrontation at the café. Beside him stood a group of Marines, their expressions a careful balance of military discipline and barely contained emotion. "Mrs. Carter," Davis greeted her, extending his hand as she stepped from the car. "Thank you for coming." Emily accepted his handshake, struggling to find her voice amid the overwhelming display of ceremony. "I don't understand," she finally managed. "What is all this?" Davis gestured toward the group of Marines. "These men served with your husband in Afghanistan, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Michael's squad." One by one, they stepped forward, introducing themselves with names that stirred distant memories. Names Michael had mentioned in his letters home, in his rare phone calls from half a world away. Jones, Rodriguez, Patel, Walsh, names that had been mere shadows now attached to flesh and blood, men standing before her. "Michael saved my life in Kandahar," Walsh said, his voice thick with emotion. "Pulled me from a burning vehicle under enemy fire. I never got to thank his family." Davis led Emily toward a building where a small crowd had gathered. Military, personnel and their families, forming a circle around something she couldn't yet see. They parted as she approached, revealing a simple wooden podium draped with an American flag. "Mrs. Carter," Davis began, his voice carrying across the now silent gathering. We are here today not only to honor Staff Sergeant Michael Carter's service and sacrifice, but to ensure that you know, truly know, that his memory lives on among those who served with him. From behind the podium, a young female soldier stepped forward, carrying a wooden plaque with Michael's name and service dates engraved in polished brass. Beside his name, the words, "Never forgotten, forever honored." Another soldier followed, bearing a framed photograph Emily had never seen before. Michael in combat gear, arm thrown casually around the shoulders of his squad mates, all of them dusty and exhausted, but smiling beneath the Afghan sun. A moment of brotherhood captured forever, preserved by someone who understood its value. He carried this with him everywhere, Rodriguez explained, pointing to a worn corner of the photo frame. Said it reminded him what he was fighting for. Not just you waiting at home, but all of us beside him. Tears flowed freely down Emily's cheeks now, but these were different from the bitter tears shed in the cafe. These were tears of recognition, of belonging, of finally being seen not just as a widow wearing a tag, but as part of something larger than herself, the extended family of those who serve. The dog tag at her throat no longer felt like a burden of memory, but a badge of connection to the men and women standing around her, their respect washing over her like a healing balm. The For Lease sign appeared in Miller's cafe window exactly 1 month after that fateful morning. Behind the darkened glass, empty chairs sat upturned on tables, collecting dust in the silence of abandonment. Local papers ran small articles about the closure, most mentioning the incident that had sealed the establishment's fate. Some called it a cautionary tale. Others, justice served. Emily paused briefly as she walked past the vacant storefront, no longer feeling the sting of humiliation, but something closer to peace. The building's fate wasn't cause for celebration, but rather a somber reminder that actions and inactions carried consequences that rippled far beyond a single moment of cruelty. She continued down the street with purposeful steps, Michael's dog tag still around her neck, but no longer clutched like a lifeline. It had become something different now, not just a memorial to what she had lost, but a symbol of the community that had embraced her. The Veterans Support Center occupied a modest building 3 blocks from the shuttered cafe. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs spanning decades of service. Faces young and old, uniforms changing with the times, but the same quiet dignity shining from every frame. Emily moved through the space with newfound confidence, arranging chairs for the afternoon support group, preparing coffee with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Carter," called a familiar voice. Lieutenant Colonel Davis stood in the doorway, a small group of new recruits behind him. "These young men and women are shipping out next week. I thought they should meet you." Emily smiled, gesturing them inside. Over the past months, this had become a ritual of sorts. Davis bringing fresh-faced soldiers to hear her speak about Michael, about service, about the invisible threads that connected those who served with those who waited at home. As she shared her story once more, Emily realized that her husband lived on in ways she hadn't imagined possible. Not just in fading photographs or polished plaques, but in the eyes of these recruits as understanding dawned. In the weekly support groups where veterans found their voices. In the community that had risen up, not with pitchforks and torches, but with silent, dignified strength when one of their own had been wronged. That evening, as Emily locked the center's doors, she paused to watch the sunset, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Michael had loved this time of day. Somewhere in the distance, a flag fluttered at half-mast, its shadows stretching long across manicured grounds. Some battles were fought with weapons, others with courage, and some, perhaps the most important, with the simple, unwavering commitment to honor those who had given everything for something larger than themselves.